Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a 30-minute radio show that airs every Saturday morning at 8:30 a.m. on KSFR 101.1 FM, your public Santa Fe public radio station. I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. Today, I'm doing a solo show during which I will reflect upon the complicated set of emotions Roxanne and I encountered while in California celebrating our daughter's graduation from med school, and then 36 hours later, welcoming our second grandchild, Ben George, into the world. It was a euphoric experience for both of these family milestones. The joy, however, was tempered by the news we were receiving from back home in New Mexico about friends who were threatened by the fire, from friends in Taos who were being told that now people from Taos County were being asked to evacuate. It was a little hard to celebrate when you knew friends and neighbors are suffering and or threatened. Welcome to the future of this world. So the week away had its extraordinary ups, but they were tinged with anxiety and worry about the state we love and our fellow New Mexicans. A few other things that transpired while we were gone will find their way into today's reflections. One of those things was my accidentally packing an extraordinary handbook I had read many years ago. It's The Cities Building Community Wealth, a democracy collaborative publication that I had long forgotten, but whose contents are ever so germane to today's discussion. The other notable event of the week was the publication of Stockholm Plus 50, an international climate report that, unlike those from the IPCC, doesn't mince words or frame findings in a context of hope born from false promises. So today, I will try to weave all these events and reports into a cogent story that leads to an almost inescapable conclusion, one reached by climate journalist and friend Nar Jamail some years ago, as he described in two Retake radio interviews in 2019 and 2021. His view: the game is long over. The battle to contain the impacts of climate change and energy is best devoted to local adaptation and resilience strategies to better prepare for what Mother Earth has begun hurling our way. But before we dive in to the two reports, some personal context to frame my reaction. On Friday the 13th, our daughter Joanna and her partner Maria both graduated from UC Davis Med School. Roxanne and I had been intimately part of the insane challenges these two now doctors had faced throughout their 4 years in med school. That included just insane, inhuman schedules, 18-hour days that began at 6 in the morning and ended at midnight. The keynote speaker underscored that the graduating docs were going to have the opportunity and responsibility to save lives and to become part of the lives of patients and families, often at their most vulnerable and terrifying moments. Given that Joanna's residency will be in the ER emergency room at Highland Hospital, Oakland's public hospital, where overdoses and gunshot wounds are the most common reasons for admission, but also where many of the very poor seek treatment for life-threatening conditions more appropriately treated in clinics, to whom many of the poor do not have access. So she is guaranteed to see people in desperate need. But the keynote speaker did not dwell on these new doctors' roles in hospitals and clinics, but rather he focused on their roles in the community. As with an MD after their name, he stated that they would be viewed as experts in the community and leaders by just the nature of their being doctors. And of course, doctors understand very intimately the social determinants of health and the social conditions that undermine good public health. And as such, these doctors have a responsibility, he asserted, to raise their voices and advocate for policy that explicitly addresses those conditions that undermine poor health outcomes. It occurred to me that the social determinants of health are often the same conditions that our world, nation, and state will need to address to prepare to adapt for the consequences of our international failure to address climate change in a timely and meaningful way. The importance of adaptation work And building community resilience was underscored by the second family milestone of last weekend, the birth of our second grandchild, Ben George, and the endless flow of photos from delivery room to homecoming, showing an entirely oblivious and innocent Ben in the arms of first mom and then dad, with our other grandson, Tori, only 2.5, looking on protectively. These shots made it clear to us why the work ahead is of such importance, as our grandkids will have to develop into adults living in the communities we leave them. So it matters how resilient communities are to face the future that will be their adulthood. In my opening remark, I noted that the goals of the Stockholm Fit Plus 50 are not dissimilar from those related to addressing the social determinants of health or building community wealth and resilience as outlined by the Democracy Collaborative. First, I quote from Stockholm Plus 50. Securing a healthy and prosperous planet for all means embarking on a joint journey where our footprint of today does not hamper the well-being of current and future generations. Stockholm Plus 50 presents an opportunity for co-creation and multi-stakeholder approach to accelerate implementation in the coming decades in areas fundamental to a sustainable future. The relationship between human and nature, what we must invest in, and how resources are used and shared, end quote. The report goes on to highlight strategies it feels can lead to a more resilient and more sustainable community world. The first strategy, accelerating the implementation of commitments for a sustainable, inclusive, peaceful, and gender-responsive future through exploring, enhancing, and through exploring enhanced and innovative financing and capacity building, and strategies that are gender responsive. That it struck me when I read that you don't normally read about gender responsive strategies in a climate report. The second recommendation was driving actions across sectors needed to recover and build forward from the pandemic and its adverse impacts on people, planet, and prosperity. Again, not a heavy focus on the traditional climate strategies, but more about economic diversity, economic democracy, and building the capacity of people and communities. The last, these are also very similar to the recommendations in the Democracy Collaborative, as we'll see. The final recommendation finally comes to a more traditional climate change kind of recommendation. Advancing policies and partnerships for transitioning to a zero pollution and nature positive global economy, including by rethinking new metrics for our economy. So promoting structures for meaningful youth the final recommendation, was promoting structures for meaningful youth participation by strengthening the voice and representation of young people and ensuring that the well-being of current and future generations is at the core of all discussions. In other words, Ben George has to be front and center. Supporting they also suggest that it is important to support the mobilization of innovation and bold action and collaboration by businesses. This is getting to the intersectoral strategy to drive system transformation. It is worth noting that the coming Stockton Plus 50 conference is occurring 5 decades after the 1972 UN conference in Stockholm, a conference that was supposed to make the link between environment and poverty and place it at the forefront of the international agenda. Even if you've only been barely paying attention, you realize how little impact that conference has had on our behavior as we burn more fossil fuels, drive more cars, produce more stuff, eat more meat, and fly more miles than 50 years ago by a long shot, when warned that we needed to transition from those behaviors. And so while the Stockton Plus 50 report strikes the right urgent tone, it would be naive, even irresponsible, to live under the assumption that change is on the way from global nations. And this in turn turns us to local strategies. So the strategies offered above from the report's executive summary are similar to the goals and strategies found in Cities Build Building Community Wealth, the Democracy Collaborative publication from which I offer this. In the interstices of the economic challenges visited upon us upon so many American nations, promising alternatives are emerging. These stories are like seeds of nourishment sprouting on vacant land. They tell us that across the United States, in more places than most would imagine, a new kind of economy is beginning to appear. It's an economy that, because of its fundamental design, tends to naturally create inclusion and prosperity for many, not simply for the few. They go on to say our city's economic challenges, they didn't go on to say this, I went on to say this. Our city's economic challenges have intensified due to the dual impacts of COVID and the growing impacts of the emerging climate catastrophe. And addressing those economic challenges will be far easier if we implement the array of community resilience building outlined in the Democracy Collaborative's publication. The report calls for, and I quote, innovative financing mechanisms like public banks and city investments explicitly designed to address poverty, energy use, and access to nutritional food, eliminating food deserts by creating local food systems. They also call for buy local policies that retain community wealth instead of exporting it to Wall Street. All of these strategies can build community wealth and resilience and build capacity to better adapt to whatever is to come. Again, from the Democracy Collaborative. Given the magnitude of the crisis we now confront, it is important to come together as never before. Our city leaders may be better positioned than anyone to help communities dream of what might be, to help communities fully recognize how great our collective power can become. As authors of this report, we hope that the time is coming when community wealth building will move from disconnection to unity, from potential power to actual power, and guiding inclusive economic development policy across the land. And as we will see from some of the examples I'm going to cite in a minute, there are abundant examples of these resilient strategies being adopted in cities across the United States. It's worth noting here that Roxanne and I went on a road trip about 2 years ago. And when we did go on, no, it's 4 years ago now. Oh my, we're getting old. 4 years ago, and we used the Democracy Collaborative and this publication to kind of guide our trip, because we wanted to visit cities of innovation, cities that were doing progressive, positive things to build community wealth and to community democracy. And so that is what we did. And so most of the cities that I'm going to be reading to you about are cities that we visited on that road trip. And we met with many of the people I'll be describing here. And so first we're going to take a little trip to Austin. In Austin, in 2014, the city launched the Recycling Economic Development Program, which includes plans to develop a 107-acre landfill site into a municipally owned Austin manufacturing hub, which will support the development of locally owned businesses transforming recyclable materials to new products. Austin was one of the first large municipal governments in the US to power all of its city-owned facilities with renewables. Its general fund has received more than $500 million from the municipally owned Austin Energy over the last 5 years, which has helped finance parks, libraries, and emergency services. What I'd like to note is $500 million over 10 years are being used to finance all kinds of important infrastructure and resilience initiatives in Austin. And these are being funded by a public power initiative in Austin. We'll find that again now here in Burlington, Vermont, became the first city in the nation to source all of its energy from renewables, thanks to its municipally owned Burlington Electric Department, which was established in 1905. Its traditional local sustainability is embedded in institutions like the Community Economic Development Office, which holds local ownership, equity, and opportunity for all city residents among its main goals. This is a theme that we need to emphasize. Two themes. One, public utility, pouring resources into public infrastructure. But the second one is the intentionality of the Community and Economic Development Office in Burlington. Their explicit purpose is to benefit low-income communities and people. One of the things that that is much earlier in the report, Cities Building Community Wealth, is that there's an abundance of evidence that just traditional economic development, even if you throw in, requirements that some jobs are given to local residents and so forth, those benefits simply do not trickle down. And so by what many of the strategies that you'll find with the community wealth building from the Democracy Collaborative involve the development of cooperative, worker-owned cooperatives and local sourcing agreements. One of the things that we found most remarkable, and this occurred both in Cleveland and in Buffalo, was how the city partnered with the hospitals in the community and the foundations to ensure that those organizations purchased all of their goods and supplies and services from local businesses. And furthermore, and we found this in Cleveland with the Evergreen Collective or Collaborative, if those resources weren't available in that community, then the hospitals would work with the city to develop local worker-owned cooperatives that could provide those services. And we met in Rochester, and I'll read to you a little bit about that. The city's first female mayor, Mayor Lovely Warren, what a great first name, has led the city to adopt community wealth building strategies. She played a leadership role in launching the market-driven community co-op cooperation, an effort to develop a network of cooperatives linked to co-op anchor institutions purchasing similar anchor institution purchasing similar to Cleveland's Evergreen Cooperatives. And so what I'd like to highlight here is that we're finding these communities learning from each other and replicating the strategies found successfully implemented in other communities. And so there we're talking about Rochester adopting strategies that have proven effective in Cleveland. And in Rochester, when we met with city leaders, we were told about how there was one major supermarket chain in the community of Rochester, and they had a great need. They were contracting with an out-of-state firm to provide their janitorial services, basically the cleaning of their stores in the early morning before they opened. And what the city did was work with those stores to build a cooperative of cleaners, cleaning teams that then did that work once the contract with the out-of-state company was abandoned. And what this does is it retains the wealth in that community so that you're not winding up with, exporting your profits to another state or to Wall Street. And this is something that could easily be replicated, say, in Santa Fe, working with Christus St. Vincent and Presbyterian hospitals. And in the instance in Rochester, it was led by a mayor who made that happen. In Cleveland, it was a single city councilwoman who went to the hospitals, initiated a conversation, went back to the city, and got the ball rolling. So it's one of the emphasis of what I'm trying to convey today is that on a local level, people of influence can actually have the power to make these things happen. We've been sitting for 50 years waiting for our international leaders to address climate change, but on a local level, within a year or two, we can create all kinds of strategies that create much more resilient communities that are capable of adapting to whatever comes from the climate, whatever Mother Nature is going to be throwing our way. And it's worth noting that Mother Nature is going to throw that our way, whether we are ready for it or not. I need to take a moment right here to just acknowledge that I'm talking from KSFR, and KSFR is our local public radio station And in times like these, with so much disinformation out there, it's vitally important that we have a source for real fact-based, research-based information, and that is KSFR. So I'd highly recommend that you take a moment to, when you're done listening to the show, go to ksfr.org and look for that donate button at the top of their homepage and click on it and give them 10 or 20 or 50 bucks and view it as your ticket for admission for a year's worth of great programming. They really need your support. So that's another source of local sustainability, local information. And so Retake Our Democracy is going to be embarking on a process of working with this handbook from the Democracy Collaborative, contacting local stakeholders, and that would include both nonprofits and city and county leaders, elected officials, to sort through these strategies and identify ones that are particularly germane to the community. It's really worth noting that in all of these communities, there's the handbook that I was referencing. At the end of it, it highlights 20 cities across the United States. And in each one of those cities, there are great examples of building local food systems, farm to table things, farm to schools, local purchasing agreements, housing development. One of the things that was most interesting was that in Burlington, they developed a land trust, and they were targeting low income housing to develop on these land trusts, 1,800 units of low income housing, not market housing like we're looking at being developed in the East Mountains in Albuquerque, for which we do not have the water, or in Santa Fe, where we're looking at, sort of a, what's the word, hodgepodge of housing development that is not intentional. Your housing planning must be intentional. And if the need for, your service workers and your hospitality workers who earn minimum wage, then that housing needs to target that. And if you start from the premise that the purpose of this housing is to address the needs of people who earn $15 an hour, then you don't build market housing. You build housing and subsidize it. And it becomes, because that's the purpose of what you're trying to do. And if you're not focused on profit, but you're focused on community benefit, then these kinds of things can be done. And, while it might seem idealistic and unrealistic, perhaps, to try and do some of these things, the Democracy Collaborative's booklet lays out in great detail how they have been done, how these things have been done, and provides contact information and everything, so you can reach out to these communities and seek their assistance and their input. And I think it's very important that we do that. It's perfectly obvious that on a federal level, we aren't going to get there. But in many of the initiatives in the Democracy Collaborative, it's a local community coming to a state legislature, and the state legislature provides some seed funding to pilot, whether it's development of an incubator for worker-owned cooperatives, or whether it's to develop affordable housing for truly low-income individuals, but the real action is in the local community, where the ideas are designed, developed, and then that you turn to the state to provide a little bit of cash to make it happen. And in New Mexico, with the amount of aid money coming from the feds and the amount of surplus money coming from gas and oil, we may have the 49th poorest state in terms of income and child poverty, but we have a great deal of wealth in our land trust and in our state investment council. And that money is largely invested in Wall Street and ought to be invested in local communities. And that's why initiatives like the community bank are so important, the state public bank rather. And, with the state public bank, they could partner with local communities and community banks and make a good deal of those kinds of strategies, those food networks, those eliminating food deserts, addressing housing scarcity, and adjusting water policy, and investing in our communities instead of investing in Wall Street. So that's another one of those initiatives that Retake is supporting. I also want to harken back to how in both Burlington and in Austin, the monies that were supporting a lot of these initiatives came from a local public utility. And that is going to be a focal point, one of the focal points of Retake's efforts in the coming legislative session, is to get a public power initiative passed. It's all the profits from our current power utilities go to Wall Street, go to PNM and El Paso Electric and Xcel, and they could go to Albuquerque, Las Cruces, and Santa Fe, and they could go to Silver City and Taos. And indeed, we have an example in New Mexico in Kit Carson's electric co-op of a community that has been proactive and intentional. And intentional is one of the key words in this whole story I'm laying out today. And but we have to start getting serious, and that means being intentional about how we're going to use our resources and our people. And so I'm certainly hoping that by using the guidance provided by the Democracy Collaborative and the 20 cities in which they've worked, that we in New Mexico can learn from this and do something to ensure that our grandkids have communities in which they grow up that are resilient to whatever Mother Nature throws our way. We're out of time for today, so I'm going to have to close the show. I want to assure you that on retakeourdemocracy.org, you will find very soon a report summarizing the Democracy Collaborative with a link to the full PDF. I'd encourage you to review that and share it with your legislator, local government, city council members, county commissioners, and mayors, and suggest that you get together with them to have a little study group about these concepts. So that's it for today. I'll be back next week, and next week I'll be back with a real guest and an interview format that we normally do. I'm sorry I sort of stumbled through this, but it's hard for me to do these solo shows. But thank you very much for listening. I'll be back next week. In the meantime, please stay safe, stay healthy, and stay active. It's the only way we fix this mess. I would like to add one last comment. We've been in the market since we came back from California, and it's shocking how few people are wearing masks. It may not be mandated, but COVID is starting to skyrocket again. We need to start taking responsibility for that. Thank you very much, and good night. Good day. Bye-bye.